I told her I was just the handyman, not the owner, not the man who had spent 31 years building that property from a half-collapsed farmhouse into something worth holding on to. Just the handyman, a man who fixed gutters and replaced water heaters and knew every crooked floorboard by name. I never planned for it to become a lie. It started as something smaller than that, a habit almost. After my wife passed, I found that when women at church or at the senior center learned I owned a farm property in eastern Tennessee plus 2 rental houses in Knoxville, the conversation changed. Something behind their eyes shifted. I was no longer just a man. I became an opportunity. So I stopped mentioning it. My daughter had been after me for 2 years to start socializing again. She said it in that careful way she has, like she's handling something fragile. "Daddy, you don't have to be alone. Mama would want you to be happy." And I believed she meant it. But I also knew she couldn't fully understand what it felt like to be 64 years old, a widower, with a modest truck and muddy boots, and a quietness that most women my age had already learned to mistake for dullness, unless they found out about the properties. Then suddenly the quietness became distinguished. Suddenly the boots were charming. I wasn't bitter. I just got careful. I met her at a grief support group of all places. My pastor had been nudging me toward it for months, and I finally went one Thursday evening in February just to get him off my back. I sat in the back row of the church fellowship hall with a cup of bad coffee, and I fully intended to say nothing. But the woman 2 seats down laughed at something the facilitator said. A real laugh, not a polite one. And I looked over, and she had this way about her, comfortable in her own skin, not performing anything. Her name was Lena. She was 58. She told the group, a retired school administrator from Nashville, who had moved to the area to be closer to her sister after her husband passed 3 years prior. She had a grown son from her first marriage. He was 26, she mentioned, and she seemed genuinely uninterested in impressing anyone in that room. I thought that was refreshing. We talked for about 20 minutes after the session ended. She asked me what I did, and I told her I kept up a property out on Sawyer Road, which was technically true. I do keep it up. I just happen to own it, too. We exchanged numbers. She texted that same night, just a simple, "It was nice talking to you tonight," and I sat with my phone for a long time before I wrote back. Over the next 2 months, we had dinners. We walked the park on Sunday afternoons. She told me about her late husband, a good man by the sound of it, a contractor who had worked himself half to death and then died of a heart attack at 61, leaving her with a paid-off condo in Nashville and a son who moved back in with her for 8 months before eventually moving out again. She talked about her son the way mothers do when they love someone dearly but are also quietly exhausted by them. I didn't press. I told her about my wife, about 40 years together, about the garden she kept and the way she hummed while she cooked and how the farmhouse still felt wrong without her in it, even now. Lena listened the way people rarely do, without waiting for her turn to speak. I appreciated that more than I could say. I did not tell her about the rental properties. I did not tell her that the farm alone was appraised last fall at just over $800,000. I told myself I would, when the time was right, when I was sure of her. But the time never quite felt right, and somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that wasn't entirely about timing. My daughter met her in April. I had them both over for Sunday dinner, which was a thing I had not done in a long time, and I watched my daughter with the same attention I used to give to weather patterns. She was polite, warm even, but afterward, when Lena had gone home and my daughter was helping me clean up, she stood at the sink with her back to me for a moment before she said, "She seems nice, Daddy. I just want you to be careful." I asked her what she meant. She chose her words slowly the way she does. "I don't know. She's fine. I just think you should take your time." Then she turned around and gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and I noted it and said nothing. I proposed in June. I know how that sounds. I know it was fast. But I was 64 years old, and I had spent 3 years eating dinner alone, and I was tired, in the bone-deep way that only people who have loved someone for a long time and lost them understand. Lena said yes and cried a little, and I felt, for the first time since the funeral, like maybe things were going to be all right. We married in August. Small ceremony, backyard of the farmhouse, about 30 people. My daughter stood beside me. She gave a toast that was gracious and genuine, and afterward she hugged Lena, and I thought, we're going to be okay. I was still the handyman as far as Lena knew. I had meant to tell her before the wedding. I had written it out in my head a dozen times. But every time I came close, something stopped me. Not fear exactly. More like a test I didn't know I was still running. 41 hours after we said our vows, I found out why I had been running it. We were sitting at the kitchen table on a Monday morning, the kind of slow, quiet morning I had always loved about that place. Coffee going. Nothing urgent. Lena's son. I'll call him by what he started calling himself around me, which was essentially nothing. He never used my name once. He had come to stay with us for what Lena described as just a couple weeks while he sorted out a situation with his apartment. I had not been consulted about this. I had been informed about 10 days before the wedding, in a tone that suggested it was already decided. He was sitting at my table eating cereal and scrolling his phone when Lena set down her mug and said, with a kind of careful brightness that I now recognize as rehearsed, "So, I've been thinking. Now that we're married, it really doesn't make sense for you to stay in the handyman position much longer. I mean, you're my husband now." I looked at her over my coffee. "What are you suggesting?" "Well," and she glanced at her son, just briefly, and that glance told me everything I needed but couldn't yet name. "I think you should think about retiring. You've worked hard. You deserve to rest." "I'm fine," I said. "I like what I do, but we should be thinking about our future." She said it gently, reasonably. "The way you say something you've practiced. We need to consolidate. Think about where we're going to live long term, what makes sense financially." I set my mug down. "Where we're going to live. We live here." She smiled. "Well, this property, you're the handyman, it's not yours. At some point your employer is going to want to do something with it. We should probably be looking at places that are actually ours. Maybe closer to Nashville. My condo isn't big, but it's paid off. Or we could sell it and put that money towards something together." I heard the words. I turned them over slowly, the way you do when you can't quite believe what's just been said to you. Her son looked up from his phone just long enough to say, "She's right, you two should have something in your names. That's just smart." Then he went back to scrolling. He was telling me what to do with assets he had no knowledge I possessed, at a table that belonged to me, in a house that was mine, on land my late wife and I had cleared and fenced and seeded and fought over and loved for over 3 decades. He said it with the easy confidence of someone who believed he was one conversation away from being handed something. I excused myself and went out to the barn. I stood there in the quiet for a long time. The smell of that place, old wood and dry hay, and the faint ghost of the animals we used to keep. I've always been able to think clearly in there. My wife used to say, I went to the barn the way other men went to the garage. She wasn't wrong. I thought about my daughter's face at the kitchen sink. I thought about that glance Lena had given her son. I thought about the word consolidate and how it had come out so smoothly, as if she'd been waiting for a moment to introduce it. I called my attorney that afternoon. He's known me for 20 years, handled my wife's estate, drawn up my will, helped me structure both rental properties into an LLC back in 2019. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "You need to come in." I went in the next morning. I did not tell Lena where I was going. I told her I had to check on a thing at the property on the other side of the county, which was also technically true. My attorney walked me through everything. The LLC structure meant that the rental income and the properties themselves were not marital assets in the same way they would have been otherwise. The farmhouse was more complicated. We'd need to look at what was disclosed during the marriage process. But because the marriage was so recent, and because I had documented my ownership clearly for decades, my position was solid, more solid than I realized. He also said something I've thought about every day since. "What exactly does she believe you own?" I told him. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me for a moment. "All right," he said. "Let's be very careful about the next few weeks." I went home and I watched. That's all I did. I watched. Over the next 10 days, I saw a version of my new wife I had not met before. She brought up the condo twice more, each time framing it differently. First as practicality, then as a dream she had about starting fresh together. Her son had stopped going out during the day. He sat in the living room with his laptop, and once I walked past and he closed it quickly, the way people do when they don't want to be seen. He asked me once at dinner how long the owner of the place usually held on to rural farm properties. "Just making conversation," he said. I said I wasn't sure, that the owner seemed pretty attached to it. He nodded slowly and went back to his food. My daughter called me one evening when Lena had gone to her sister's for a few hours. I stepped out onto the porch and we talked for a long time. She was upset, not in an explosive way, but in the quiet, controlled way that means something real is happening underneath. She said she'd been doing some asking around. She had a friend who knew someone in Nashville who recognized Lena's name. There had been another relationship a few years back with a retired physician. It had ended badly, apparently. She didn't have specifics, but she had enough. I listened. I thanked her. I told her I was handling it. Are you sure, Daddy? I'm sure. I had a conversation with Lena that Sunday evening after dinner. Her son had driven out somewhere, and it was just the two of us on the porch. And I want to say this clearly. I did not go into that conversation angry. I went into it sad, because I had genuinely liked her. I had genuinely believed in that grief support group on a cold February night that I had found someone real. I told her I needed to be honest with her about something. She straightened slightly, the way people do when they sense the ground shifting. I told her I wasn't the handyman. I told her about the farm, about the LLC, about the 2 rental properties and the farmhouse itself, and the fact that everything was documented, structured, and protected and had been for years. I watched her face while I said it. I want to be fair to her. I'm not sure exactly what I saw. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was more like recalibration, like a person quietly revising a plan they had already begun executing. She said after a long pause, "Why didn't you tell me? I wanted to know you first," I said, "before you knew about that." She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "I think I owe you an honest conversation too." I won't go through all of what she said. Some of it I believe, some of it I don't, and sorting between the two is a work I may never fully finish. What I know is this. Her son had debts, significant ones. She had been carrying some of them. She had been hoping, her word, that our marriage would create some shared stability. She said she hadn't meant for it to go the direction it had been going. She said she still cared for me. I believe the debt part. I'm less sure about the rest. I called my attorney the following morning. By the end of that week, we had begun the process. It was not ugly in the legal sense. There was not enough time for things to become tangled, which is exactly why my attorney had told me to move carefully and quickly. Lena's son was gone within 4 days. Lena herself left 2 weeks after that, back to Nashville, back to the condo she had suggested selling. She sent me a text the night before she left. It said, "I'm sorry it turned out like this. I think I made some wrong choices. I hope you find what you're looking for." I sat with that message for a long time. I do not know if she is a bad person. I have met people in my life who did bad things without being, at their core, bad. People who got desperate and made choices they might not have made otherwise, and who carry that. I genuinely don't know which kind she was. I may never know. What I know is what I told my daughter when she came over that Saturday, the first weekend after the house was quiet again. She made coffee and sat across from me at the same kitchen table where Lena had first said the word consolidate, and she looked at me carefully and asked how I was doing. I told her I was all right, and I meant it, not in the way you say it to make someone stop worrying, but actually, I was all right. "You knew," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I suspected," I said. "There's a difference." She nodded. She wrapped both hands around her mug the way her mother used to. Outside the window, the fields looked the way they always look in September, golden and slightly tired and still beautiful. "The handyman thing," she said, almost to herself, "that was smart. It was your mother's idea," I said. She looked at me. "She used to say, you probably don't remember this, you were young. She used to say, never show a man everything he thinks he wants before you know what he's going to do when he gets it." I paused. I just applied it differently. My daughter was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, and it was the real one, the one that does reach her eyes, and she shook her head slowly. "You could have told me what you were doing." "I know," I said. "I should have. I was worried about you. I know that too." We sat there a while longer without talking, which is something we've always been able to do, and the coffee got cold and neither of us moved to warm it up. I am not going back to the grief support group. Not because I'm bitter, I don't think I am, but because I don't think grief is the thing I need to be sitting in a circle talking about right now. What I need is simpler than that. Some mornings I walk the fence line before the sun gets high, the way I used to do with my wife, and I let myself miss her properly. And then I go inside and I make breakfast and I do the day. The farmhouse is still mine. The properties are still mine. The floorboards still creak in the same places. The barn still smells the way it always has. I learned some things. I learned that loneliness will make you move faster than you should, and that moving fast is not always wrong, but it costs you something either way. I learned that a person can sit across from you in a grief support group and seem genuine, and maybe even be partly genuine, and still be running a separate calculation in the background. I learned that protecting what you've built is not the same as being closed off. It just means you've earned the right to be deliberate. And I learned, or maybe remembered, that my late wife was wiser than most people I will ever meet. I talk to her sometimes still, out by the fence in the early mornings. I don't know if she hears it. I choose to believe she does. She would have seen Lena coming from across the room, I think. She would have sat quietly, the way she did, and said nothing until we were alone. And then she would have looked at me with those eyes and said, simply, "Walter, that woman wants something." She always called me by my full name when she was being serious. I miss that more than I have words for. But I am still here, still standing on land we built together, and that for today is enough.